In 1986, Richard addresses a large audience in the UK to promote his new book, Dinosaur and the Man. Its central claim, that humans and dinosaurs once lived side by side, is met with open ridicule. As the audience challenges him, Richard responds with increasingly conspiratorial answers, which only deepen their skepticism. After the event, a wealthy man approaches Richard with news of a discovery in the Simpson Desert in the Australian Outback. Richard immediately seizes on the find, convinced it could provide the missing evidence for his theory. He goes even further, arguing that dinosaurs were not giant beasts but a humanoid reptilian race that interbred with chimps to create the first humans. Rather than dismiss him, the wealthy man is amused and intrigued. He agrees to fund an excavation and gives Richard permission to assemble his own team. Donald and Mildred spend a day together on the beaches of Queensland, and their relationship appears affectionate and secure. The mood changes when Mildred receives a phone call and claims there is an emergency at work that requires her immediate attention. In reality, Mildred is leaving to meet Gary, with whom she is having an affair. Gary is recently divorced and has children. His marriage ended largely because of his repeated infidelity, though he still provides well for his family and lives comfortably in a luxurious apartment. The contrast between the two men is sharp. Donald owns a home, but it is worn down and reflects his limited means. Gary, by comparison, represents wealth, confidence, and physical excitement. Mildred is drawn to Donald for emotional reasons, but Gary offers the sexual and material appeal she does not find in Donald. Despite his obvious flaws, Gary is generally capable, practical, and eager to act decisively when a situation calls for it, especially when he has a chance to appear heroic. Mildred practices unsafe sex with Gary but not with Donald. Weeks later, all three have been informed about the excavation and have accepted the offer to join it. Around the same time, Mildred tells Donald that she is pregnant. Donald assumes the condom must have failed and is overjoyed. Deeply in love with her and guided by traditional family values, he uses what little money he has to buy an expensive engagement ring, even selling family heirlooms to afford it. His feelings for Mildred are sincere, but there is also a rigidity in him. If the life he imagines with her begins to collapse, he is the kind of man who may choose flight over confrontation. Gary, meanwhile, takes a more practical approach to the trip. A keen gun enthusiast, he insists they should be armed and stows a shotgun in the back of the ute. Mildred sees this as an overreaction, but Gary argues that the wildlife of the outback, especially dingoes, could pose a genuine threat. The group meets Richard at the airport, and he quickly assumes control of the expedition. Gary, by contrast, falls into easy conversation with him almost at once, and the two spend the evening before departure sharing a few beers and getting acquainted. The team of paleontologists travels to a dig site in the Simpson Desert after the discovery of unusual dinosaur fossils. On the journey, Donald proposes to Mildred, and she accepts. Gary is clearly unsettled by her answer. Richard tries to keep the group focused, believing the discovery could transform humanity's understanding of dinosaurs. He even speculates that the site may contain evidence suggesting humans once lived alongside them. Gary dismisses Richard's theory as absurd. To him, the expedition is little more than an elaborate hoax, another Australian tall tale in the same spirit as the myth of drop bears. He assumes the whole thing is designed to wind people up and make outsiders look foolish. Richard then tells the group more about the wealthy backer behind the dig. From his description, Mildred seems to recognize who he means, but she says nothing. Donald notices her silence immediately, and begins to read more into it than the moment may warrant. Already uneasy about their relationship, Donald starts to suspect that Mildred has concealed parts of her past and may have had many lovers before him. He reaches this conclusion on very little evidence, but the speed of his suspicion reveals how fragile his trust already is and how quickly his insecurity turns into paranoia. Because they arrive too late to begin the excavation, the team sets up camp for the night. Away from the others, Richard speaks privately with Gary. Gary admits that he has been having an affair with Mildred behind Donald's back, and he is stunned that she accepted Donald's proposal. Richard urges him to set the matter aside and focus on the dig, convinced they may be on the verge of a discovery that could change everything. Gary remains skeptical, dismissing Richard's hopes as wishful thinking. Unbeknownst to them, Donald overhears the conversation and learns the truth. During the night, Donald hears whispers drifting across the outback. Unable to make out the words, he grows increasingly irritated. Short-tempered and highly sensitive to noise, he cannot ignore the sound and leaves his tent to investigate. The whispers lead him to the dig site, where he becomes convinced that something is buried beneath the sand. He drops to his knees and claws at the ground with his hands, digging frantically as the whispers drive him further into a frenzy. Then, without warning, the voices stop. A flashlight beam suddenly lands on him. Richard stands over him, furious that the excavation site has been disturbed. Donald, never one to back down, reacts with equal hostility. The argument escalates almost immediately into a savage fight, and the two men batter each other until both are left unconscious. Mildred wakes at dawn and is unconcerned to find Donald missing. She makes coffee and eats breakfast without giving his absence much thought. Gary soon joins her, and their conversation turns to their affair. Mildred makes it clear that she intends to continue seeing him behind Donald's back, much to Gary's satisfaction. The two slip into a tent together. Afterwards, Gary notes that neither Richard nor Donald has been seen all morning. He goes to look for them, accompanied by a reluctant Mildred, who would rather go back to sleep. Donald regains consciousness just as the excavation site begins to give way beneath him. The ground trembles, and a section of the dig suddenly collapses inward, opening a jagged sinkhole in the earth. Acting on instinct, he scrambles clear of the crumbling edge and hauls himself to safety. Richard is not as fortunate. Still dazed from the fight, he loses his footing and disappears into the hole. For a moment Donald stares into the darkness, but fear quickly overtakes. Certain that no one will believe Richard's fall was accidental, he convinces himself that he will be blamed for the man's death. Panicked and struggling to think clearly, Donald rushes back to camp, hoping a few moments alone will help him decide what to do. Instead, he finds the tents eerily silent and completely empty. There is no sign of Mildred or Gary, and the stillness of the abandoned camp only deepens his fear. His thoughts spiral quickly from shock into self-preservation. Convinced that staying will only condemn him, he hastily gathers his belongings, takes the car, and flees the site, desperate to put as much distance as possible between himself and the collapse. Richard wakes in a narrow underground tunnel and quickly realizes there is no way back to the surface. The shaft above him has collapsed into darkness, leaving him trapped below. With only his flashlight to guide him, he follows the passage deeper underground until it opens into a vast hidden city, ancient in its age, yet impossibly advanced in its design. Towering structures of stone and metal stand side by side, their surfaces lit by mechanisms that still pulse with life. To Richard, the place feels less like ruins and more like evidence of a civilization erased from history. As he explores, faint whispers begin to drift through the streets and chambers around him. He cannot tell where they are coming from, and each attempt to trace them only leads him further into the city. Eventually he discovers what appears to be a vast archive, a chamber filled with holographic records, diagrams, and moving symbols projected into the air. The language is unfamiliar, and much of what he sees is beyond his understanding, but Richard immediately begins forcing the fragments into a theory that suits the way his mind works. Richard's mind thinks of Sahul, the Ice Age landmass that once joined Australia and New Guinea, and of the first human crossings into Australia more than 65,000 years ago, proof that seafaring and organized movement across water existed far earlier than most people casually imagine. Then he jumps to the lands drowned after the last ice age, to the way coastlines vanished, and oral memory can outlive the maps that erased them. In his mind, this city is not a fairy tale but the missing remnant of one of those lost literal worlds, a settlement cut off when sea levels rose, then preserved below the desert as climates shifted and the continent dried. From there his reasoning turns more reckless. He starts folding in the known record of outside contact with Northern Australia. Macassan voyagers, older arguments about movement through Wallacea and Torres Strait, and the long, controversial history of scholars trying to explain change in Australia through external influence. Richard takes all of that, and pushes it well past the evidence. To him, the architecture suggests not random contact but continuity, a hidden tradition of engineers, astronomers, and navigators whose knowledge survived in fragments while official history forgot the source. The holographic records become, in his interpretation, the kind of archive that might sit behind later legends of vanished cities, flood traditions, and culture bringers who arrive from the sea with knowledge ordinary societies cannot explain. What he is seeing may have no such connection at all, but Richard reads every surface as if it confirms a single idea. That history is not missing because it was lost by accident, but because the most important chapter was buried, denied, and remembered only as myth. Before Richard can make sense of what he has found, the whispers swell around him, no longer distant but immediate, pressing in from every direction. Shapes flicker at the edge of his flashlight beam, too quick and indistinct to identify. Then the darkness surges. Unseen hands seize him, drag him off his feet, and pull him screaming into the depths of the city. Mildred and Gary arrive at the dig site to find the excavation has collapsed into a vast sinkhole. Fearing Richard and Donald have fallen in, they shout down into the darkness, but no answer comes back. They return to camp to gather ropes, lanterns, and climbing gear, only to discover that the car is gone. Gary immediately assumes Donald survived the collapse and fled after killing Richard. Mildred is less certain. She believes both men may still be trapped below and convinces Gary they have no choice but to descend and recover them, alive if possible, or at least bring back their bodies. To explain the missing car, she clings to the unlikely idea that it was taken by a passing desert thief. Back at the sinkhole, the two begin their descent. The walls are unstable, and halfway down Gary loses his grip, slams into the rock face, and is knocked unconscious. Mildred checks that he is still breathing, then leaves him where he fell and continues alone, driven more by instinct than loyalty. Following a narrow passage away from the collapse, Mildred hears the same whispers that lured Donald into the night. They drift through the tunnel ahead of her, drawing her onward until the rock corridor opens into the hidden city below. The sight stops her cold. Vast structures rise out of the darkness, their ancient surfaces threaded with impossible light. For a brief moment she is too stunned to move. Then movement erupts in the shadows around her. Creatures surge from the ruins and close in fast. Mildred survives only because of her athletic training. Her background in martial arts and acrobatics allows her to dodge, climb, and scramble through the city's fractured architecture before they can overwhelm her. Bruised but alive, she disappears deeper into the maze of streets and broken towers. Donald drives hard across the desert, desperate to outrun both the whispers and the collapse he left behind. For a few moments the empty road seems to promise escape. Then the voices return, closer this time, threading through the car like a sound coming from inside his own skull. Startled, he looks up just as a wall of rock thrusts violently from the earth in front of him. He has no time to brake. The car slams into the rising stone with crushing force, spinning sideways as metal buckles and glass explodes across the cabin. Before Donald can recover, the ground beneath the wreck gives way. Car and driver plunge into a fresh collapse, dropping into darkness below. When the wreckage finally grinds to a halt, shapes are already moving around it. Creatures close in from every side, tearing at the twisted metal until the car is ripped open. Donald's screams are swallowed by the dark, and he vanishes beneath the swarm. Richard wakes to find a nameless man standing over him. The stranger speaks fluent English, explaining that he learned the language by studying the history of the civilization above. Calm but unsettling, he tells Richard that the whispers are not random sounds but the voice of the city itself, calling out to draw living beings into its depths. According to the man, the city became sentient long ago. It now sustains itself by feeding on the inner energy of humans and other creatures, absorbing life to preserve its own existence. In an attempt to destroy or poison this living system, the nameless man created shadow creatures and used them to abduct children in the night, hoping to turn them into weapons against the city. The experiment failed. The monsters were never perfected enough to corrupt the city, and instead became part of its violence. Now, with Richard in his grasp, the nameless man believes he has a new opportunity. He intends to use Richard as the next stage in his experiment, certain that this time he may finally create something powerful enough to infect the city from within. From the highest surviving point of the city, Mildred pauses long enough to take stock of what lies below her. The place is magnificent in a way that unsettles her: avenues, towers, and terraces arranged with an intelligence that feels both ancient and impossibly precise. Instinct takes over. Although she was pushed into paleontology by her parents, photography has always been the discipline that feels natural to her, and she begins documenting the city through her camera as if the lens might impose order on what her mind cannot yet process. Then she spots a statue on a lower platform, and statue of the same man Richard encountered below, rendered with the kind of scale usually reserved for founders, lawgivers, or saviors. Risking exposure, she climbs down to photograph it. At the base she notices an inscription carved in ancient Greek, "The Great Plague." The wording catches her attention because it carries the weight of historical condemnation rather than simple description. It makes her think briefly of the plague tradition that runs through Greek history and literature, the Plague of Athens, recorded by Thucydides, where disease exposed the collapse of order as much as the collapse of bodies, and the world of Hippocrates, where illness was wrestled away from superstition and forced into the language of observation, cause, and consequence. Looking from the inscription back to the statue, Mildred has the passing impression that this man belongs to that same historical pattern, one of those brilliant Greek figures who might begin as a benefactor and end as a warning. Not a god or a king, but someone closer in type to a physician, engineer, or civic mind whose work crossed a line and became inseparable from catastrophe. For a moment she wonders whether the monument was first raised in his honor and only later altered, the way public memory turns when admiration curdles into blame. The thought flickers through her, and is gone. She takes the photograph and moves on, filing the detail away without yet understanding what it means. Gary regains consciousness and stays still for a moment, gathering his bearings. Realizing Mildred has gone, he chooses the opposite path Richard and Mildred took and heads deeper into the underground ruins alone. Before long he comes upon the wrecked car, torn open as if it has been mauled from the outside. Nearby he finds Donald, still alive but in the midst of a grotesque transformation into one of the city's creatures. Whatever resentment Gary feels toward him is outweighed, for the moment, by the fact that Donald is still recognizably human and in obvious agony. When creatures emerge from the darkness and close in, Gary runs to the boot of the wreck and retrieves a shotgun. He proves himself an expert marksman, dropping the attackers one by one before they can reach him. With the immediate threat gone, he turns his attention back to Donald and resolves to get him somewhere safer, hoping medical help might still be possible. Nearby, Gary spots what appears to be an old elevator shaft leading to the surface. He uses it to haul Donald back up to the camp and leaves him there, believing it is the only place where he can be kept out of immediate danger. Then, armed with the shotgun, Gary takes the lift back down. With no other route open to him, the only direction left is toward the city. The nameless man seals Richard inside a tube and injects him with a virus designed to accelerate the experiment. The change begins almost at once. Richard's body twists into something more powerful and more controlled than the other creatures, a refined version of the same corruption rather than a mindless mutation. As the transformation takes hold, Richard turns on the nameless man. The man tries to restrain him, but the creature is too strong. Overwhelmed, he breaks free and flees into the city's corridors. Desperate, the nameless man finds Mildred and tries to convince her that Richard, now transformed, is hunting them both. Mildred recognizes him immediately from the statue she photographed earlier. Realizing he is the same figure tied to the city's buried history, she does not hesitate. Instead of trusting him, she drops him with a single punch. The transformed Richard attacks Mildred, but before he can reach her, Gary appears and shoots him dead. For an instant there is silence. Then the whispers return, louder than before, and creatures begin to gather from every direction, closing in around them. The nameless man regains consciousness long enough to deliver a final explanation. He insists that the plague was necessary, that it was the only weapon capable of destroying the sentient city from within. But even as he speaks, the infection Richard passed to him begins to take hold. Gary sees the change immediately and, without hesitation, kills him before he can transform any further. With the creatures converging and the city itself turning against them, Mildred and Gary are forced into a desperate retreat. The tunnels shift, barriers rise in their path, and the city seems almost to anticipate every attempt to escape. Fighting their way through the ruins, they finally reach the elevator's shaft and claw their way back to the surface. When Mildred and Gary finally reach the camp, they discover that Donald has already completed his transformation. What remains of him attacks without hesitation, cutting them down before either has time to react. Once they are dead, the Donald creature drags their bodies back below ground and carries them into the heart of the hidden city. There, at its center, the corpses begin to glow. Their fading light is drawn out of them and absorbed into the city itself, feeding the vast organism that has manipulated them from the beginning.